I think it's fair to say that several, maybe all of us, have faced various challenges in our lives, either our own or those maybe of our family or friends, times when we've maybe had times when our heart broke for maybe a child of ours or a grandchild or brother, sister, family member, friend. And these things have affected maybe our attitudes and our self-esteem and perhaps how we have related to others. There was a physical education teacher named Lonnie Edwards is his name, in Georgia, and Nancy was a young girl in Georgia, and she was born, with partial fingers, and she was about 12 years old, and Lonnie was the physical education teacher, and she and Nancy had made it, through school. I mean, but because of her disability, she was kind of the target of a little bit of ridicule amongst the children, which happens. And if we think about it, when we were younger, that maybe there were times when we had something where we were the ones being made fun of, and maybe there were times when we joined in on making fun of someone else, and so she's introduced to the physical education instructor to take a dance class, and she just really does not want to do this. And so she privately reveals to the teacher, Mr. Edwards, the why of it, and he more or less says, we can't do anything about that, but we can overcome it. And so you hold your head up, and he actually would take the square dance class they were putting on. Anybody have to take square dance when they're in Phi Ed, when they're like 3 or 3rd grade or something? And she did overcome it. And Nancy Miller would go on in her life to where she would type 65 words a minute and learn to play the piano. I type 40 words a minute. I can play the piano, not anything you'd recognize, but, that would be about the size of it. And Nancy would later say, this is over 50 years ago this happened, Nancy would later say that she grew up because of one man. Now, I got a story to kind of contrast with that. Some of you have maybe heard of a man named Charles Colson. He died, I don't know how many years ago Charles Colson died. But Charles Colson told the story of serving as an armed forces officer, and he was stationed at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. And he was involved with leading training exercises out in hot desert-like conditions. He tells the story, or told the story, he doesn't tell anymore because he's dead, but he told the story in one of his books about how some of the local peasants would make a few dollars off of these exercises. They'd come out riding their burros and they'd pack soft drinks in ice, if you can think of maybe having a burlap saddlebag or something, and they'd sell these soft drinks to the troops while they were on maneuvers. And while this was against military protocol, it was something that was ignored. So one day, Officer Colson decides he's going to be full of himself, and actually, to the surprise of the men he was commanding, ordered that the goods of this local peasants be confiscated and sent this man packing without his merchandise or the money he was figuring on making. And it was 40 years later that he was writing about this. He said the incident, he could still recall in vivid detail the look of disappointment, perhaps of desperation, on this man's face as he rode away, most likely and quite possibly dead broke. Now, you know, we can remember that, some of us can remember the telephone on the wall, and there was a telephone company jingle. It was reach out and touch someone. And I think it's fair to say that these stories reflect quite different ways of doing just that, in a human and emotional way. I mean, I think they do well for us, setting the stage for the look at a touch of a different kind. Now, we're starting, of course, in the Gospel of Mark today, and where our passage that Gary read began, Jesus has just cast a legion of demons out of a man into a herd of pigs. If you're familiar with the account of that incident, you'll know that it didn't end well for the pigs. And the people of that region, well, they pleaded with Jesus to leave their region. Well, they didn't want to lose any more pigs, is what they were thinking. But we can see how the touch of Christ can be experienced, because as we join our reading, we see where Jesus is on a way to a synagogue leader's home. And I'm going to read the passage again. I don't know, Austin, if you still have that handy, if you could pull it back up, that would be okay. And if not, it's in Mark 5. Mark 5, verses 21 through 34. And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." So Jairus comes seeking the touch of Christ for his daughter. And he went with him. And a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had had a discharge of blood for 12 years and who had suffered much under many physicians and had spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, "If I touch even his garments, I will be made well." And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." You know, we have a woman here that has a lot of problems. I mean, and it all stems from one thing. You know, she's got the physical suffering part of this. She's broke because of this problem. She's a social outcast. She probably didn't get invited to many parties. It made her quite bitter, in fact, which would make her even get invited to fewer parties or gatherings. She was always religiously impure. So she really couldn't go into the court of temples, the outer courts. And she probably carried, we could say perhaps carried, maybe not probably, a load of guilt. Not uncommon in those days, and there's other scriptural passages where it's addressed where, you know, maybe she thinks this condition of hers is some sort of punishment for sin in her life. We might, you know, you and I, we might want to sit down and analyze these problems and discuss which was her worst problem, and, you know, and of course that would do her no good whatsoever. But it's fair to say that she had some pretty low self-esteem, and, you know, really when we, you know, we can add all these up, or with all these problems, they're probably overwhelming for her, but she would take the step of reaching out to Jesus. Now, you know, the passage there, it's nice to talk or to think about how this was some great display of faith on her part. You know, a lot of people, you know, had a tradition of that day. They held to it was really a superstition in a way, of that touching the garment of an eminent personality could give one access to their power. And, you know, and a lot of people think, and there's some justification for that fringes on clerical robes that you'll see they're a symbol of a tie to this, that where, for instance, we touch. Now, of course, if she was going to pick a personality, she probably picked the right one. I mean, you're not going to pick Zacchaeus, the tax collector, to touch the hem of the robe. She picked the right personality to gain access to the power of Jesus. But even with this superstition being considered, this woman, as low as she was on the social order, I mean, she wasn't going to the local stable hand. So she took her timid faith and approached, again, not just anyone, but Jesus. So superstition or faith, this took courage on her part. Because, you know, you're talking about, first of all, here's Jesus. He's got a throng of people around him here. And I don't know, he probably didn't know that he had just run a bunch of pigs off a cliff. But because she's mingling with this crowd and she doesn't belong. In fact, it's, you know, she doesn't belong either on a social basis or if there's a lot of Jewish people here on a religious basis. In fact, she could have had the whole area to herself if she'd have done as required and shouted, "Unclean, unclean!" And boy, you would have seen them people scatter like rats off a ship. But she didn't. So this really serves as something to show us how oftentimes it will take courage to practice our faith. Because she was somewhere she didn't belong, and she knew this. And it also shows us that the result that can be experienced by reaching out to the Christ in faith, even if it is just that faith the size of a mustard seed that we've heard of. The result being that experiencing of the touch of Christ. Now, consider for a moment this crowd around Jesus and his entourage. Now, they're heading to the home of Jairus by name. I mean, Jairus was an important synagogue leader. And Jairus' daughter is dying, and he's seeking for his loved one. His heart is breaking for his daughter, and it's breaking for himself. And she's seeking the touch of Christ for her. And a large crowd follows and is pressing the group together when this woman sees her chance to experience the touch of Christ. She summons up her courage and with her mustard seed of faith gets close enough to make that touch, to experience that touch. She does it. She got close enough for the touch of Christ. And so, this will give you and I a question to ask ourselves. Am I close enough to Jesus to experience the touch of Christ? Now immediately, we read in verse 30, Jesus realized that his power had gone out to this woman. And he reacts. It's recorded in verse 21. Who touched my clothes? Now, let's envision this exchange. Maybe I'm there and maybe you're there, so we can kind of think like we're quite around here. And Jesus says, who touched my clothes? Well, to paraphrase a little bit what the disciples say, who touched my clothes? What kind of stupid question is that? Can you imagine me saying something like that? Can you imagine yourself? Maybe you imagine me saying it more than you imagine yourself saying it. But you see this crowd we're in? It's worse than a can of sardines. And what do you mean, who touched my clothes? Come on. We need to get to Jairus' house. Remember, his daughter's dying. That might be a typical human response. But as often is the case, God's wisdom is different than my wisdom. God's wisdom is different than human wisdom. And perhaps, rather than bringing up the point that we need to get to Jairus' house, God would maybe ask, or want us to ask things like, who touched me? Or, who can I touch? Or we'll say, I don't have time. I've got to get to Jairus' house. But if we'll honestly look past that idea that we've got to get to Jairus' house, we'll see that God's wisdom is evident with that question. who touched my clothes? Now, we can ask why this question was so important to Jesus. That's a fair question. Did Jesus just want to know? You know, I don't think so, but perhaps he wanted the crowd to be aware that a miracle had taken place, that a healing had happened. Do you suppose he wanted to point out that this woman's small mustard seed, timid, humble faith played a role in her healing? You know, and again, a fair question to ask. It may be easy for some to say that we have a desperate woman here with nothing to lose. If it doesn't work, she can just slip away with no one knowing she was even there, and Jesus tells her, no, 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 no. It's not going to be that way. Just a little side trip down the road, we talk about prayer. I heard, it was a few weeks ago, one guy was talking about prayer, and remember where we're at here. Jesus is going to tell her her faith has healed her, so just, don't forget that. It's like this card I got this last week. It said, what do we want? A better memory. When do we want it? When do we want what? But it was David Jeremiah actually who said that, because his people had told him, he says, Pastor, we've tried everything we want, and all we've got left now is prayer. And he told him, he said, why did you start with prayer? So I just had to get that in. It was kind of laying here. So, but in this case, Jesus tells her her faith has healed her. So how about this woman knowing she's been given this healing and she's been given God's peace? Because as with most of the people Jesus touched, he tells this woman to go in peace. And that sounds like a real simple statement, but it's not. It's as often with many things that Jesus says and does, it's much bigger than that, because it's really a command from Jesus. We're sitting here thinking, go in peace, Well, okay, well, one thing I pray, and I pray it all for each of you, every day, is that this will be a pleasant day. So that's kind of what we're thinking. Go in peace. Okay, I'll go have a good day, Jesus. Thanks. But it comes through a little bit louder than that when we look at it, because it's as if he's saying, you've been touched by the power of God through Jesus Christ. Go and serve as a conduit for that power and touch others. Not that we should get wrapped up in doing good things just for doing good things, because then we're not actually sharing the touch of Christ. Then it's like I'm sharing the touch of Don. We're sharing our own touch without the power of Jesus. We're just on our way to Jairus' house. You see, we all have an ailment. We've talked about different problems and challenges people have faced. We all have this condition. We all have this challenge. The same challenge and the same ailment. It's called sin. And Jesus is the only answer for what ails those of us who have this challenge, it's a polite way of saying it, called sin. And not, a certain pastor we listen to, or the right Bible study, or the service project that makes us feel nice and warm inside, but Jesus himself, the touch of Christ. So the question again is asked, am I close enough to Jesus to experience his touch? You know, that's a real important question. It's also a yes or no question. And if one has no for the answer, it's time maybe to see what the obstacles are. Is it anger? Guilt? Fear? Trust? Indifference? You know, this woman approached fearfully. And you think it was easy for her to tell Jesus the whole story? Probably not. And yet these guys that were walking with Jesus are going, hey, we got to get to Jairus' house. They seemed a little indifferent. Chuck Colson was a little full of himself when he was commanding maneuvers in Cuba. But we need to ask and look to see what our obstacles are, and to continually ask for God's help in overcoming, because without that touch, we don't allow Jesus to say to us, go in peace. And when we're in that spot, it's a sad thing. For you and I and for others. Because this world we're living in, it really needs something. And what it doesn't need just to know about Jesus. It doesn't need to know about the touch of Jesus. What this world really needs is to experience, actually, the touch of Christ. Let's pray. Father, we ask that you help us to take the touch of Christ that we've received and touch others with it. We lift this prayer in Jesus' name, and all God's people said. Now, Charmaine is going to come up and we're going to close with number 335. Turn your eyes upon Jesus. And I'm going to give you a little benediction because, you know, it was a number of years back that we did some testimonies here, and one of the testimonies was, without Jesus, you wouldn't want to know me. Now I know that even with Jesus, there may be some that don't want to know me. But the Christian can live for Christ because they've experienced the touch of Christ. With the love of the Father, the grace of the Son, and the power of the Spirit, go in peace. Number 335.